in doing so, I'd like to present my colleagues on the branch, Mick Hassett, Treasurer, Ian Ferguson, Secretary, and John Weaver, as you know, Delegate and NEC member. We've asked the National President to come here tonight. It was due from a branch meeting about the state of industry, things we talk about at branch level. I know there's lads here from other pits, and you can talk about things at branch level, but it's nice to have somebody from the NEC. We are lucky in having John Weaver, but it does give some other lads a chance. And without further ado, I'll introduce the National President to speak to us on the state of the industry, Mr. Arthur Scargill.
Comrade Chairman, comrades, the last time I spoke in this welfare was in 1981, and on that occasion I arrived to be greeted by a fanfare of press correspondents who informed me that the Tory government had supposedly done a U-turn and changed their philosophy from one of pit closures to one of conceding the demands of the National Union of Mine Workers. There were men who said, it's true, we've heard it on BBC and ITV, and the hacks of Fleet Street were convinced that Mrs. Thatcher and the Tories had done a historic U-turn. When I spoke from this platform, I said that I did not believe that this government had done a U-turn as far as the industry was concerned. Not only that, but I questioned the motives of those in our union who were prepared to accept at face value a Tory party's philosophy to reconsider its decision as far as the industry was concerned. I firmly believe that a fundamental mistake was made when the National Executive Committee decided to accept the government's policy and agreed that the pits would be reviewed in the normal procedure, and in the meantime the list proposed for closure of 23 pits would be withdrawn. That wasn't a U-turn. It was a nice body swerve. It was a body swerve by a Tory government who were determined to destroy the mining industry and along with it the National Union of Mine Workers. Once again, we meet at a very historic point in time. At a time when we face a demand from within the union for a higher pay increase, and also the commitment of our membership against pit closures and reduction in manpower levels. There are those who say that these two issues are separate and should not be linked in any way by the National Union of Mine Workers. I hope to show this meeting tonight that far from being separate issues, they are linked not by the NUM, but by the decision of the Coal Board to insist on closures, reduction in manpower levels as a price, not for a substantial increase, but even for a bare increase of around 5.2%. Let's deal first of all with the claim for wages. Since 1970, and that happened to be the year when we had a major dispute in this industry, miners' wages have been eroded by over 23%. Every one of you today are 23% worse off than you were in real terms in 1974. During that period, we've also seen a dramatic erosion of many other benefits received by the NUM. For example, anti-social shift payments, something that management very rarely know about. We got in 1974 £1.40, and in outside industry the average payment for antisocial shifts was around £1.20 to £1.40. In 1980, the average payment for unsocial hours in this industry has been raised from £1.40 a week to £4 5 a week. In outside industry, on average, we've seen an increase from £1.20 and £1.40 a week to an astonishing £22 a week. No one can deny that miners have suffered dramatically as a consequence of that. Of course, when you listen to the board talk, you would think that we hadn't earned the right to a decent wage or an increase in fringe benefits. To listen to the board talk, you would be overcome with emotion. And I'm sure that those people who were collecting for the rugby club would give a donation towards the board if they could listen to their arguments. To meet them is a scene that can only be compared with Coronation Street. I only wish you were there. On the one side, the NUM, and on the other side, the board. And 3 years ago, you had difficulty in telling the two apart. And they walk in, all with their folders, having been briefed over a hamburger breakfast, what they should say and what they shouldn't. And the coal board have a magnificent way of presenting their case. The sum total of the coal board's presentation rests with their chairman. The rest of them sit there like dummies out of Burton's window. And Cowan, the deputy chairman of the board, I'm sorry Ian, but he's a Scotsman, opens up, Arthur. I know there's something wrong when he says Arthur. You will appreciate the industry is going through a very difficult phase. And I looked under the table to see the tape recorder were there, because he said it last year. He said, the board are facing enormous international pressures. We have great internal problems, and there are significant difficulties with many of our older pits. We've examined your claim, and I can understand your sincerity. I says, thanks. But really, he said, if we're honest, if they're honest, eh? If we're honest, we couldn't concede a penny. I said, that's normal. However, now you always know it's good when they say, however, we've looked at our books and we've decided, because we want a fair industry and a fair wage, we've decided to offer you 5.2%. And he looked like a bloke that's offered you crown jewels. 5.2%. So I said, what about the rest of the arguments we've put forward? He says, we've looked at them, but we can't concede them. But I said, can I remind you, you already did. We claimed rate protection. And 3 years ago, the board agreed that they would concede the principle of rate protection and guaranteed they'd introduce it as quickly as possible. The only section of our workforce who do not enjoy protection of earnings are those who actually produce coal. McGregor's got it, the director's got it, your colliery manager and your deputies got it, and full-time officials of this union's got it. There's one difference between me and them. I believe that when a man starts work in this industry, it is absolutely criminal to tell him that when he leaves work, he will have been downgraded onto a minimum rate because he's no longer able physically to continue on a face rate job. It's time that this union said that when a man has to go onto a lower paid job due to illness or an accident, he gets the same wage that he would have had it not been for the accident or the illness in this industry. The same dignity as applies to everybody else. And secondly, we ought to say that our members should be entitled to a salary basis. The board agreed to that as well. They agreed that we should be paid on a salary agreement. There are some in our industry who say, well, what's the point of a salary? The reason that you don't get people advocating from the board side a salary is because the continuation of a day wage agreement divides our members. If you're off work, you get no wages. If the colliery manager's off work, or the deputy, or the overman, or the board member, they get the money. In fact, once again, the only person who isn't guaranteed a salary arrangement in this industry are those who actually produce the coal. And it's time that our members, working in the bowels of the earth, enjoyed the same rights as other sections of the industry itself. And the third thing that we argued was consolidation of the bonus payment. In 1978, for those who have forgotten, the incentive scheme was rejected by the membership of this union in an individual ballot. A fact either conveniently ignored or deliberately forgotten by the national media, television and radio. They ignore it or deliberately distort the fact because it doesn't suit their arguments. Not one word of protest was heard from the media when the membership of this union 55% to reject an incentive scheme. The National Executive, in cahoots with the Coal Board, introduced by a backdoor method a so-called area incentive arrangement. I'll tell you one of the reasons, above all others, why the incentive scheme was introduced. It was to pay the men at Edlington a different rate of pay to those at Brodsworth, and a different rate from those at Monkton Hall, and a different rate from those in South Wales. It was to split you and to divide you, to put man against man and pit against pit and area against area. And to some degree it succeeded, and you all know it. And it's time that we said to the board, this incentive scheme should be completely re-examined. They agreed to consolidate payment into the basic wage. When it was first introduced, it was less than 2% of your total wage. Tonight, as I speak in this meeting, incentive pay accounts for 22% of your wages. And you're rapidly reaching a position where incentive pay is playing a bigger part than increases on basic rates. And that brings me to the question of basic rates. Since 1974, you've dropped 45 places down the wages league. You're now way behind literally dozens of other industries and falling behind every day and every week throughout the year. And whatever the board can continue to direct their attention and yours towards the incentive arrangement as opposed to your basic rates of pay, they'll continue to divide you and they'll continue to split you off from other workers in other industries. We also argued for a reduction in the working hours and working week. How many people realise that in 1919 a Royal Commission agreed to the introduction of the equivalent of a 4-day working week, and yet here in 1983 still working the same hours as we did at the beginning of the 70s. Every other major industry in Britain has seen a substantial reduction in the hours of work, and in Fleet Street we've got print workers working a 4-day working week with no loss of pay. I suggest to you that if this union had displayed the same militancy over the past 4 years that it did in 1971, 2, 3 and 4, you'd have had a 4-day working week rather than continuing to work the hours that you are at the present time. Someone said, Sheffield, I understand, Arthur, you've got an overtime ban. I said, aye. He says, how long is it going to go on? I said, that's for the members to decide, but I'll tell you my view. I said, if there was any intelligence and on this fundamental question, they would stop trying to work an 8-day week and begin the campaign for a 4-day week with no loss of pay, and give the kids on the dole a chance to have a job rather than seeing them suffer the indignity of permanent unemployment. It's essential that we begin to get our priorities right in this industry and in this union. Let me say this, Chairman. I'm in favour of a 5.2% increase in pay, on one condition: that it's 5.2% of McGregor's salary. That would give you £66 a week increase. Ask your colliery manager how much he'll get. He'll get £28 a week increase by getting 5.2% of his salary. We'll have his. We'll suffer. We'll pull his belts in. We'll show an example for Britain. Who do they think they're kidding? They've just awarded Vauxhalls 8%, the firemen 8%, the police officers, our colleagues on the other side of the picket line, 8%. And they talk about us having 5.2. There are 4 to 5 other industries who've already had increases of 8% or more, or 50% more than what you've been offered at the present time. Now let me say this, Chairman. I was asked what we were going to do about the wages offer. When we finished negotiations, or rather when the board had, I emerged from Hobart House and said, on this occasion, the membership will decide the matter. Over the last 18 months, whilst I've been president of this union, I've given a lead on 2 occasions. And on both those occasions, my members have decided not to accept that advice. I believe that you're now reaping the consequences of those decisions. But I was not prepared to give a lead on this occasion and find myself 5 miles out in front with my members going the other way. And that's why the executive, with John and convene special meetings of this union, consider the wages offer, look at the wage claim of the union, and tell us what you want to do. At the same time, we asked all branches to consider the situation in the industry, their attitude on the question of pit closures and reduction in manpower levels. And above all, if they decided that they wanted to do something positive, tell us what to do. We called a special conference of the union on the 22nd of October. And at that meeting, I made it clear that the union would accept any resolution proposed from the floor of that conference, reflecting the views of the rank and file of our membership. There were only 2 resolutions proposed. One was to reject the coal board's offer as wholly inadequate and instruct us to go back and negotiate. Secondly, to oppose pit closures and further reduction in manpower levels, and to take a decision to implement a full overtime ban from the end of October to preserve our standard of life and our jobs within the industry. That decision, before it was put, attracted one amendment, and the amendment was that we take action a week before was proposed in the... And after listening to the discussion, the amendment was withdrawn. Every single delegate had the right to speak or vote. Every single branch of this union had the right to participate. And the decision to reject the wage offer and to impose a ban on overtime was unanimous. And I believe that I'm right to argue on behalf of this union for a decision taken by our membership. Doesn't it strike you as hypocritical that we've got those socialist daily newspapers like The Sun, the Daily Mail and the Express suggesting that we do this, do that and do the other? Let the miners ballot, says The Sun. Who the hell balloted for their editor? Probably page 3 pin-up girls, I don't know. The Daily Express. Now there's a typical example of democracy, isn't it? Lord Welks Matthews owns it. Now he's a real socialist, he is. Multi-millionaire, avowed opponent of trade unionism, determined to smash the trade union movement. And these people are telling us what to do. Doesn't it strike people as rather peculiar that miners only decide in Britain to impose an overtime ban, and it attracts the most horrendous attacks upon our people, and yet the same newspapers sing the praises without exception about a trade union in another country? I reckon there's something rather peculiar about newspapers who do that. It's time that they recognise the depth of feeling in our industry on the question of wages and conditions. And that brings me to the question of the situation in the industry itself. I've a bit of up-to-date information, Johnny. Mr. McGregor, the hamburger lad himself, that new starter, a juvenile in our industry, 71 last month, has started having that traditional breakfast time meeting. Just like that. And he's had all the press there over breakfast. No doubt pouring fat on his bacon. And do you know what he says? He says, the board have now decided that they have to close in the immediate future every pit where the cost of production is over £60 a tonne. And so these hacks are scribbling away, so my mole tells me, without an iota of reasoning, and certainly no knowledge of what it means. Well, I'll tell you what it means, because I've got the figures. That policy, advocated on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, will mean, as far as the mining industry in Britain is concerned, the closure of 44 pits. And those 44 pits are part and parcel of the 70-pit hit list of the board. Do you want to know where they are? It means 4 pits in Nottinghamshire. It means around 4 pits in the Midlands, It means 10 pits in Yorkshire. It means 15 pits in South Wales, 4 pits in Scotland, and the elimination of the Kent coalfield. And let those people who question what the union are doing at the present time listen to what McGregor's had to say and then make up their minds whether we've got to fight or accept the proposals of both this government and the board. History should teach all of us what's taking place in this industry. Throughout the 60s, we saw butchery on a scale unprecedented. We saw over 500 pits closed as governments, Tory and Labour, preached at the altar of Middle East oil. We saw over 600,000 men lose their jobs, coldly and calculatedly put into operation their closure plans. And to its eternal shame, we saw this union throughout the 60s stand idly by in total impotence while mass murder was inflicted on the mining industry. There were those who used to say, if we go on strike or we fight against closures, it'll mean a reduction in our wages. There were others who said, if we press for higher wage increases, it'll result in more and more closures. Absolute rubbish. Throughout the 60s, our industry were accepting 6 old pence a week increase. And it didn't save a pit or a job. On the contrary, it resulted in massive closures and a huge cutback in this industry. To give you some idea of the problem, in 1972, when the oil was quadrupled in price, it has now been estimated that the price of dependence on Middle East oil cost the British taxpayers £20,000 million more than it would have done had they been based upon British coal mined by British miners. And here we are again, fighting against a closure programme. Here we are, still seeing the importation of foreign coal and still witnessing an entire lack of real subsidies for our industry. I want to say one thing about government policy. I'm the first to condemn the Tory government's policy and attack. But there's one lesson this union must learn, and that is that when we next get a Labour government, we mustn't adopt one policy under a Tory government and a different policy under a Labour government. And we've got to say to that Labour Party, when you are the government, show us the same consideration that the Tories show to their class when they're the government of the day, and give us some assistance. There's also the question of huge subsidies detrimentally affecting our industry. Really affecting the industry. And some of the things that take place defy description. In Western Germany, they receive the lowest subsidy of any Western European country apart from Britain. And they get £25 a tonne for every tonne of coal they produce. In Belgium, they get £115 a tonne. And in France, it's about £56 a tonne. In communist Poland, or the Soviet Union, that's for the benefit of Newsline, what they get is £30 a tonne for coal that's more highly priced than ours. We produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. We've got the most sophisticated, technologically advanced industry in the world. And yet, we're facing unfair competition. If we receive the same subsidy as is given to the German miners, our industry begins to make £600 to £700 million profit. And at the same time, we begin to export what are, after all, the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. We're living in a stupid, mixed-up economy and a rather short-sighted world. About 3 years since I went to the United States, and apart from one intervention in Denver, which I saw many other things. When I went to Colorado, to the United Mine Workers Convention, there were 4,000 delegates. And the president of the US Mine Workers, Sam Church Jr., gave his presidential address, all 25 stones of him. And he had a spittoon. And it was at the time of the Iranian crisis. And I was all agog to hear this exposition of the American mining industry. And Sam stood at the microphones with the television cameras of America on him and said, "My friends, we're going to tell those Iranians we ain't having it." And he got a standing ovation. And I says to Gormley, "Hey up, when the talks, just mention Iran, they can't go wrong." He says, "My friends, I want to tell you that there ain't nobody going to push us Americans around anymore. And we're going to tell this Ayatollah Yoli Yoli," he meant the Ayatollah, "that we're not having it." Standing ovation. I says, "Joe, just mention Ayatollah, 2 standing ovations, they can't go wrong." And then he said, completely changed his tack. "I was privileged to be elected president of this union." Actually, he wasn't. He was appointed, but that doesn't matter. He says, "Now, I thought about my predecessors, the legendary John L. Lewis." And this audience stood up. I says, "Jewer, 3 up." And he says, "I decided on this my inaugural address to honour the memory of John L. And along with my beautiful wife, Paddy, we've..." Take a bow, Patty, and she went, "We've decided to write a little song. And I'd like for you folks to hear it." 4,000 delegates here. And he stepped back from this microphone, and through the amplifying system came, "John L. he was a man, and I knew him well." So when the record had finished, this is midway through his address, he says, "Folks, I knew that it'd touch you. And I sincerely hope that as you leave the auditorium today, you buy a copy of my record." Now, I'm not influenced one way or the other by suggestions of the connections with the American mafia. And the fact that I've got a dozen of those records is pure coincidence. And I looked at Gormley and I says, "Jewer," I said, "it's the last conference next year, isn't it?" He says, "Yeah, it is, lad." I says, "What about the Nelly singing a song?" He says, "Does think it'd go down well?" I says, "Ah." He says, "It's a good idea, that, Arthur." I says, "Dance Swanee, they've sold it often enough." But anyway, we were taken along to see the imports of foreign coal. And I was amazed. We got a ship loaded with coal in West Germany, where it's heavily subsidized, coming across the Atlantic Ocean to America. It was unloaded and sent to the United States steel industry. And I'll honestly say that I could not even believe my eyes. The same ship that brought the German coal and sold it to the United States steel industry was then loaded with American coal, and it was shipped back across the Atlantic to Rotterdam and Great Britain, and it was argued that that represented cheap imported fuel. How silly can we get? But that's a fact, and this is how badly we've been affected as a result of subsidies abroad. Of course, I've been told by the board that if I keep referring to them dealing with the accounts in a funny way, I could get taken to court. I've been threatened with libel. I'll tell you what my response is. If they take me to court for libel, I shall at least be able to discover in the court all those documents that they won't give me at the present time. They're absolutely astonishing. Loans to members of the board, other items, 500 million. Do you know what they're doing? It costs the miners in Britain and the industry £38 to produce a ton of coal. That's the cost of production. And if they sell a ton of coal, they sell it for a minimum of £38. So far, so good. And we've got 25 million tonnes stocked on the ground. Do you know how much they've valued it in these accounts? They've put a value in these accounts of £30 a tonne. So I'm only a naive lad from Yorkshire. I said, excuse me, but if you've only put a value of £30 a tonne, that's £8 less than it cost us to produce it, and at least £8 less than what we're going to get for it when we sell it. No, Mr. Scargill, we don't do our accounts like that. That's right. I said, but what you've done is this. You've undervalued the stocks of coal by £200 million. And in April this year, you reported to the British people a loss of 111 million. I said, if you'd have made the value of stocks that which is real, you would have had to report £100 million profit. Why have you done it? They said, that's the way we do our accounts. I'll tell you what it means. The £200 million that they've deliberately undervalued in these accounts is equal to £21 a week increase for every miner in Britain. Not only that, but the coal we've got stocked is costing the taxpayers £7 a tonne to stock it. Costing the industry £7 a tonne. It means nearly £200 million to stock it on the ground. And in my innocence, I suggested, why don't they sell it at the price at which they've valued it, less the £7 it's costing to stock it? And if my maths are right, that's £23 a tonne, the cheapest in the world. I said, is it not fair to suggest that if you did that, you could sell all the coal that we've got and still save £200 million in the accounts? And this bloke, the financial whiskey to the boat, says, you could say that. I said, I did. It's astonishing but true. If you look further in these accounts, it gets better. We pay 366 million back to government for money that we've borrowed to capitalise our industry. That's £2 million for every... So Edlington, before it gets off square one, is £2 million in the red. And that's accounted for by the development costs of Selby. Well, are we entitled to pay it? Particularly for the younger members of this audience, I'll tell you a few real facts. when we nationalised the industry, the private owners received £28 million a year subsidy from the government. It's a load of bunkum to say that subsidies are unknown. Private enterprise got subsidies from this government. Just as agricultural enterprises, farmers, get 1,500 million in assistance every year. When we took them over, we not only had to take over the debt-ridden industry, we had to recapitalise a clapped-out industry. And the only way we could do that was to put new equipment in. Do you know what the government did? They refused to allow this industry to charge the price for a ton of coal that was being charged everywhere else in Europe. And they made us charge £2 to £3 a tonne less. Now, I don't mind that. We're a nationalised industry. But it really is blackmail when a government says you can't charge the economic price for your product and so robs the industry of about £6,000 million and then says you've got to borrow money to put capital equipment into the industry. So we were paying